Thank you so much, Colleen. It's always strange for me hearing my bio because it makes me sound so amazing. Um, but yeah, so thank you once again for this opportunity. And I'm going to be speaking on the role of power in drug policy. Okay. So I think we can all agree that the drug prohibition has failed. But I don't think we really realize the kind of power that it has allowed on certain institutions and organizations to control society. And I think that's an element that we really need to start looking at, because as much as we can talk about how police are arresting people and how different governments really influence how South Africa, for example, guides or governs its society, we are not necessarily aware of the kind of power that drug prohibition has given to institutions. And so drug prohibition has given power of the police not only to arrest people, but it has given them the opportunity or the tools to really oppress marginalized communities. And we see this a lot around arrests of people who use drugs. And this was mentioned in a previous session about how police's performance is really guided by the amount of arrests that they do. And it's unfortunate that we're basically counting the performance of police by the number of arrests that they're making, instead of really looking at how society is really changing and maybe how safe society is when it comes to police's performance. So police as well are used as tools within the drug economy. So drug prohibition has given the police the power to oppress humans, but it has also given power to the illicit market. And this is an element that we tend to forget. And unfortunately, police officers are not paid enough, and this has led to corruption, which has led to police officers really becoming pawns and tools of drug cartels. So another element is the exertion of power by foreign states. We talk a lot about the US, and we don't necessarily have clear examples about the impact that they actually have on compromising the sovereignty of states. And I'm just going to give you tell you a little story about the influence of the US on an incident that happened with the African Union. So I was invited to speak by the African Union at a meeting, and I was going to speak on harm reduction. And the program was set, and unfortunately, when it came to approving the program, I was clearly asked to not be included in the program. So the reason for this was because I seemed to have a very strong harm reduction perspective, and so my section or opportunity to speak was completely scrapped out. We also see how the United States, because of funding UN agencies and the amount of funding that they actually put into the harm reduction strategy, has really imposed this drug prohibition perspective in countries. And so countries are forced to implement not necessarily not harm reduction strategies, but drug prohibitionist approaches to addressing drug use, which has, as Colleen mentioned, exacerbated or continued the legacy of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. The compromised power that drug prohibition has afforded is that it has obviously compromised the power of police, not only to be able to get information for people who use drugs, it has also compromised the police's ability to correctly gather intelligence, and also leaves police vulnerable to being exploited by drug cartels. As I mentioned, corruption and the low salaries of law enforcement officers has resulted in them being compromised and exploited by drug cartels, and they're being forced to execute the oppositions because of the influence of the drug cartels. However, we are seeing policy shifts, and this has really been key in giving power not only to civil society organizations, but communities of people who use drugs. And decriminalization conversations, not only being at the international level, has also resulted in the shifting of power, where people who use drugs and community or civil society organizations are really being invited to tables to discuss policy shifts and policy decision makings, which basically encapsulates our theme of putting people first and hearing and learning about experiences from people who use drugs and not necessarily getting the top-down approach and rather a bottom-up approach where we are listening to what people need and not telling people what they need. There's also been activities where police officers are being sensitized. I don't want to sound as an advocate for law enforcement. However, we are seeing that law enforcement officers are starting to realize the failure of the approaches in arresting people who use drugs, because they're talking about this vicious cycle where they continue arresting the same people. And so efforts are being made where people who use drugs are actually being invited to train the police officers on how to treat key populations, so sex workers, LGBTIQ plus communities, and people who use drugs. And even though we are slowly seeing shifts, it's better to change one life than to not change anything at all. And so these efforts are really seeing some progress in how we can better police drugs. And so in conclusion, criminalization has compromised the power of police and state sovereignty. Police are an extension of political ideologies, and if you want to understand how political issues are, you look at the police. And so, however, when it comes to translating policy changes within the governments, we don't necessarily see it being translated to law enforcement officers. So national policies can sound great. However, when you go and speak to law enforcement officers, they don't know about the policy changes. We still have law enforcement officers saying that cannabis is legalized, and we're not only seeing it in law enforcement officers, but also civil society organizations that think or believe that cannabis is actually legalized, but that is not the case. And so we need to start educating people on the correct terms and even translating policies in a simpler form, not only to key institutions, but also to people on the ground. And decriminalization can see shifts in the distribution of power, allowing for more bottom-up approaches to policy. In essence, we need to start putting people first. Thank you.